Fyodor Dostoyevsky, a literary giant of the 19th century, remains one of the most profound thinkers in history. His works dive deep into the human psyche, confronting the complexities of morality, faith, suffering, and freedom. Dostoyevsky's understanding of life is unlike any other, offering a raw, unfiltered exploration of what it means to be human. In this video, we'll explore the life and legacy of Dostoyevsky, revealing why he is considered the writer who truly understood life. Fyodor Dostoyevsky's life was a series of profound struggles, each of which contributed to the intensity and depth of his writing. Born in 1821 in Moscow, Dostoyevsky grew up in a strict religious household. His father, a domineering figure in his early life. His formative years were marked by the discipline and structure of a military academy. Yet it was the death of his mother and the early loss of his father that would significantly shape his worldview. As a young man, Dostoyevsky was driven by a thirst for intellectual and philosophical exploration, seeking to understand the world in both its moral and existential dimensions. But as he navigated the uncertainties of adulthood, he found himself entangled in the political unrest of Russia during the 1840s. At the age of 27, Dostoyevsky's life took a sharp and irreversible turn when he was arrested for his involvement in a group that had been deemed subversive by the Russian government. In 1849, he was sentenced to death by firing squad, a punishment that was commuted at the last moment to a grueling sentence of exile in a Siberian labor camp. This was perhaps the defining moment of his life, as the trauma of near execution and the years spent in the harsh conditions of the camp deeply affected his psyche and philosophy. The psychological and physical toll of his time in Siberia would stay with him for the rest of his life, providing him with an intimate understanding of suffering, punishment, and redemption. Upon his return to society, Dostoyevsky was no longer the same man. His time in the labor camp left him with a deep sense of personal guilt, an acute awareness of human frailty, and a profound appreciation for the grace of faith. This period of suffering would give rise to some of his greatest works, where the exploration of human suffering and redemption became central themes. His return to the literary scene was not without difficulty. He struggled with financial instability, personal crises, and a profound sense of alienation, yet it was this very disillusionment that led to some of the most deeply reflective works in world literature. His personal life, too, was filled with profound loss and hardship. After his first wife's death, Dostoyevsky married a woman much younger than him, and their tumultuous relationship was marked by both devotion and deep psychological strain. Financial struggles plagued him throughout his life, leading to a cycle of debt, gambling, and desperate attempts to maintain his livelihood. Yet, despite these personal challenges, Dostoyevsky's literary output remained remarkably consistent. It was as though the inner turmoil he experienced personally fed directly into the existential crises of the characters he created. His life was one of contradiction and complexity, and it is these same contradictions that make his writing so universally compelling. Dostoyevsky's understanding of the human soul was nothing short of revolutionary. He didn't view people as simply moral or immoral, good or bad. He saw them as deeply conflicted beings, each struggling with their own inner turmoil and external circumstances. He believed that every human being was capable of great love, compassion, and understanding, but also deeply capable of cruelty, self-destruction, and despair. He explored these themes through characters who were at odds with themselves, torn between contradictory impulses, desire for power, yearning for redemption, fear of God, and disdain for moral systems. In characters like Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, the underground man from Notes from Underground, and even Karamazov from The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoyevsky distilled the essence of the human condition, showing readers not only the darkness that resides within us, but the potential for transcendence through suffering and self-awareness. Raskolnikov, the young student in Crime and Punishment, embodies the existential struggle of a person torn between intellectual arrogance and profound guilt. He is a character who believes that certain individuals have the right to transcend moral laws in order to achieve a higher purpose, a theory he tests by committing murder. His internal battle, however, becomes the heart of the novel, as Raskolnikov's intellectual convictions crumble under the weight of his conscience. His descent into madness and his eventual moral redemption through suffering highlight Dostoyevsky's view of the human soul as capable of both terrible depravity and ultimate salvation. Similarly, the underground man represents a more abstract form of psychological torment. He is a man paralyzed by self-awareness and mired in a world of self-pity and self-loathing. His writings are a desperate attempt to understand his own existence, to explain the contradiction of a man who both desires to be loved and despises those who would offer him affection. The underground man is a nihilist who believes that the meaninglessness of life offers no hope, yet he is constantly tortured by the idea of freedom and choice, which he cannot fully embrace. Dostoyevsky's portrayal of this character shows how intellectualism and detachment from the emotional and spiritual realms can lead to a deep sense of alienation and despair. Ivan Karamazov, one of the central figures in the Brothers Karamazov, grapples with the problem of evil and the existence of God in a world filled with suffering. His philosophical dialogues with his brother Alyosha form the crux of the novel, as Ivan presents his rebellion against a God who allows innocent children to suffer. Ivan's struggle represents a more radical form of skepticism, questioning not only the existence of God, but also the entire framework of moral law and human responsibility. His ultimate rejection of faith leads to his psychological unraveling, illustrating Dostoyevsky's belief that a life devoid of spiritual grounding leads to internal chaos and spiritual ruin. In all of Dostoyevsky's characters, there is a common thread: the constant struggle between opposing forces within the self. His portrayal of human nature is not a static one. Rather, it is dynamic and multifaceted, shaped by the choices we make, the suffering we endure, and the faith we either embrace or reject. Through his vivid characterizations, Dostoyevsky invites readers to engage with the most profound questions about existence, morality, and the nature of the self, questions that continue to resonate with readers even today. For Dostoyevsky, the human soul was not simply something to be understood, it was something to be experienced. His works are not just narratives, they are profound psychological explorations that demand introspection from the reader. They challenge us to confront our own contradictions, our own potential for both good and evil, and the complex interplay between intellect, emotion, and spirituality that makes us who we are. Dostoyevsky's exploration of the human soul laid the groundwork for modern psychology and existential philosophy, influencing thinkers such as Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre. His psychological insights have stood the test of time, offering a window into the complexities of the human experience. Yet it is his ability to portray the human soul in all its contradictory, multifaceted glory that cements his place as one of the greatest writers to ever live. Dostoyevsky's writing resonates not only because of its philosophical depth, but because of its uncanny ability to capture the essence of what it means to be human. His characters may suffer, but it is through their suffering that they find meaning. His work ultimately reflects a belief in the possibility of redemption through love, through faith, and through an unflinching confrontation with one's own demons. It is this belief, born from his own experiences of suffering and transcendence, that makes Dostoyevsky one of the most enduring voices in world literature. Dostoyevsky's understanding of the human condition was rooted in his own experiences of profound personal and intellectual struggle. Through the lens of his life, we can see how deeply intertwined suffering and spirituality are in his worldview, and how his understanding of the psyche continues to challenge and inspire readers across generations. It is no exaggeration to say that Dostoyevsky's works offer a roadmap for understanding life's most perplexing questions, a map that remains as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. Dostoyevsky's exploration of the human soul has given us some of the most vivid and disturbing portrayals of human beings grappling with their inner demons. But his genius lies not in merely showing us the darkness of human nature, it is in showing us the possibility of redemption, even in the face of our worst flaws. Through his characters, Dostoyevsky presents a world where the struggle for meaning is constant, where moral choices are fraught with uncertainty, but where the human spirit can, at times, emerge triumphant. Dostoyevsky's understanding of the human soul continues to shape the way we think about psychology, philosophy, and the intricacies of the human experience. His works are not simply novels, they are philosophical treatises, psychological case studies, and spiritual reflections all rolled into one. In every page, he invites readers to confront the deepest parts of themselves, to understand the contradictions and complexities that define us all, and to ultimately seek redemption through suffering, self-awareness, and faith. Fyodor Dostoyevsky's relationship with faith was one of the most profound and complex aspects of his life and work. He was not a mere religious apologist, nor was he a dogmatic believer. Instead, his exploration of faith was deeply personal, shaped by his own suffering, doubts, and moments of spiritual revelation. Unlike many religious writers who present faith as a simple solution to human suffering, Dostoyevsky delved into the depths of existential agony, depicting characters who struggle with faith, reject it, or find themselves unable to live without it. His works are filled with characters who question God, challenge religious morality, and wrestle with the idea of divine justice. Yet, at the core of Dostoyevsky's literature, there is always a sense that faith is not only necessary, but the only true path to salvation. Dostoyevsky's own life mirrored the struggles he depicted in his characters. As a young man, he was influenced by revolutionary and socialist ideas, which often carried an atheistic worldview. His early association with the Dostoyevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals who discussed political and philosophical ideas considered radical at the time, led to his arrest and near execution. However, his experience in Siberian exile transformed him. Surrounded by hardened criminals, suffering the harsh conditions of prison life, and stripped of his former intellectual arrogance, he began to see faith in a new light. He was exposed to peasants who, despite their suffering, held on to their religious beliefs with unshakable conviction. Their unwavering faith in God, despite their misery, deeply affected him. In their suffering, he saw a form of transcendence, a connection to something greater than themselves. It was in prison that Dostoyevsky returned to Orthodox Christianity, though his faith was never simple or uncritical. This internal battle between belief and doubt plays out in almost all of his major works. Dostoyevsky does not offer easy answers about God or religion. Rather, he presents the full weight of the struggle that accompanies faith. His characters are often intellectuals, skeptics, and sinners, torn between a desire for absolute freedom and the deep need for spiritual meaning. Nowhere is this tension more evident than in The Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov represents the quintessential intellectual atheist, while his brother Alyosha embodies a pure-hearted, almost saintly faith. Ivan, a highly intelligent and philosophical man, cannot reconcile the idea of a benevolent God with the suffering of innocent people, particularly children. His famous argument against God, presented in the chapter Rebellion, remains one of the most powerful and unsettling critiques of religious belief in literature. Ivan does not deny the existence of God outright, but he refuses to accept a world in which God allows innocent suffering. He describes in vivid detail the brutal injustices inflicted upon children: beatings, starvation, unimaginable cruelty, and argues that no divine justice can ever justify such horrors. Even if a higher plan exists, even if all suffering is somehow redeemed in the afterlife, Ivan rejects it. He refuses to participate in a world where such suffering is allowed, and in doing so, he returns his ticket to God. This existential defiance is not unlike the anguish expressed by real-world philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, both of whom were deeply influenced by Dostoyevsky's work. Yet, Dostoyevsky does not let Ivan's rejection of God stand unchallenged. In the novel, his counterpoint is his younger brother, Alyosha, a gentle and deeply faithful novice monk. Alyosha does not attempt to intellectually refute Ivan's arguments. He does not engage in theological debates or offer logical proofs for God's existence. Instead, his response is rooted in love, humility, and the personal experience of faith. For Alyosha, faith is not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, something that cannot be reasoned into or out of. It is something that must be felt, experienced, and embodied. He sees faith not as a solution to suffering, but as a way to bear it with grace and meaning. This contrast between Ivan and Alyosha captures the central dilemma of Dostoyevsky's exploration of faith. Is it possible to believe in a just God in a world filled with suffering? And if we reject God, what is left? While Ivan's perspective is persuasive and deeply unsettling, Dostoyevsky ultimately suggests that a world without faith is one of despair, nihilism, and moral collapse. He does not ignore the intellectual challenges of belief, but he insists that faith is the only thing that can save the human soul from destruction. Dostoyevsky's own struggle with faith was deeply intertwined with his understanding of human nature. He believed that without God, human beings would fall into moral chaos. He explored this theme in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov, a brilliant but destitute student, convinces himself that moral laws do not apply to extraordinary individuals. He believes that in a godless world, superior men have the right to commit crimes in the pursuit of a higher good. But after committing murder, he finds himself haunted, tormented by guilt, and unable to escape the weight of his own conscience. His descent into psychological torment and his eventual redemption through faith and suffering reflect Dostoyevsky's belief that without God, morality loses its foundation, and the human soul is left in ruins. This theme is echoed in Demons, also known as The Possessed, where Dostoyevsky takes his critique of atheism and political nihilism even further. The novel presents a society on the brink of moral collapse, where radical intellectuals convinced that God is dead seek to replace religion with their own ideologies. These revolutionaries believe that, in the absence of divine morality, they must create their own system of ethics, one that justifies violence, manipulation, and even murder in the pursuit of their goals. Dostoyevsky depicts these characters not as villains, but as deeply misguided individuals whose rejection of faith leads them into moral and psychological ruin. At the heart of Dostoyevsky's exploration of faith is the idea that suffering is not meaningless. In his personal life, he endured tremendous hardship, imprisonment, exile, financial ruin, the death of his children, and lifelong struggles with epilepsy. Yet he never succumbed to nihilism. He saw suffering as a crucible, a means through which human beings could attain spiritual transformation. This idea is powerfully expressed in the brothers Karamazov through the character of Zosima, an elderly monk who teaches that suffering, when embraced with humility and love, can bring people closer to God. Unlike many religious writers who depict faith as something easily attained, Dostoyevsky shows that true belief comes through struggle, doubt, and pain. His characters do not blindly accept faith. They are often dragged toward it, kicking and screaming, through their own failures, guilt, and despair. He presents faith not as an intellectual conclusion, but as an existential necessity, something that must be lived and experienced rather than merely understood. Dostoyevsky's exploration of faith, doubt, and God remains deeply relevant today. In a world where existential crises, moral relativism, and the search for meaning continue to dominate philosophical discussions, his work provides a powerful meditation on the necessity of belief in something greater than oneself. He does not offer easy answers, nor does he ignore the powerful arguments against faith. Instead, he presents the full weight of the struggle, showing both the depths of despair that come from rejecting God and the profound redemption that can be found in embracing faith. Through his novels, Dostoyevsky argues that faith is not for the intellectually weak or the naive, but for those who have confronted the abyss and found that without belief, nothing remains but chaos. His vision of faith is not one of blind obedience, but of profound spiritual transformation, a belief that can only be forged in the fires of suffering and self-reflection. It is this depth, this unflinching confrontation with both belief and doubt, that makes Dostoyevsky one of the most powerful and enduring voices in the exploration of faith and the human soul. Freedom was both a profound gift and a daunting burden for Dostoyevsky, and it is this paradox that he explored with such intensity in his works. He recognized that freedom, in its purest form, carries with it not just the ability to make choices, but the overwhelming responsibility that comes with those choices. For Dostoyevsky, freedom was not an abstract ideal. It was deeply tied to human suffering, moral conflict, and existential anxiety. His exploration of freedom and the burden of choice permeates his novels, where his characters are often caught in the tension between personal liberation and the fear of the consequences that their choices might bring. Dostoyevsky's own life was a testament to the complexities of freedom. In his early years, as a young man under the oppressive Russian Empire, he was exposed to the limits of personal freedom through his political involvement. His arrest and subsequent imprisonment for participating in a group that advocated for reform and intellectual liberty was a brutal reminder of how political structures can stifle individual autonomy. His sentence was ultimately commuted, but not before he experienced the terror of a mock execution, an event that left an indelible mark on his psyche. This experience of being physically constrained, of having his freedom taken from him by external forces, sparked his lifelong contemplation on the nature of freedom, both on a personal and societal level. However, Dostoyevsky's view of freedom was not just political, it was deeply philosophical. He believed that true freedom was found not in the absence of constraint, but in the ability to confront one's deepest fears and desires, and to navigate the moral and existential dilemmas that come with human existence. For Dostoyevsky, freedom was not a condition of liberation, but one of struggle. He saw the human soul as constantly torn between conflicting desires: the desire for self-preservation, the desire for power, the desire for love, and the desire for truth. And it is in the tension between these desires that freedom, in its most profound sense, is exercised. One of the most poignant examples of this conflict can be seen in Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist Raskolnikov embodies the ultimate confrontation with freedom and moral responsibility. As a young man, Raskolnikov is convinced that certain extraordinary individuals have the right to transcend moral laws in order to achieve a higher purpose. He believes that by committing murder, he can free himself from his poverty and suffering, and that this act will ultimately serve a greater good. His intellectual justification for the crime is a manifestation of his attempt to assert his own freedom, to break free from the constraints of morality and societal expectations. However, once he commits the murder, Raskolnikov is immediately faced with the crushing weight of his actions. Raskolnikov's freedom, far from liberating him, becomes the source of his torment. He is consumed by guilt, and the very choices he made to assert his autonomy lead him into a spiral of psychological and emotional decay. His internal conflict is a reflection of Dostoyevsky's belief that the exercise of freedom without moral or spiritual grounding leads to chaos. Freedom without responsibility, for Dostoyevsky, is not true freedom at all. It is a form of self-destruction. Raskolnikov's attempt to transcend moral laws through his crime results in his complete moral and psychological collapse, demonstrating the dangers of absolute freedom when divorced from ethical constraints. Raskolnikov's story highlights the central idea in Dostoyevsky's exploration of freedom, the realization that every choice carries consequences, not only for the individual, but for the greater moral fabric of society. In a world where the ability to choose freely is paramount, the burden of that choice becomes overwhelming. For Dostoyevsky, this burden is inescapable. His characters are often faced with situations where they must make difficult choices that challenge their moral and spiritual beliefs. The weight of these decisions, coupled with the knowledge that freedom means the responsibility to face the outcomes of those decisions, is a recurring theme throughout his works. In The Brothers Karamazov, this tension between freedom and responsibility is embodied in the character of Ivan Karamazov. Ivan is an intellectual who rejects God and traditional moral systems in favor of a philosophy of absolute freedom. He refuses to accept a world in which innocent suffering exists, and, in doing so, attempts to free himself from the moral constraints of religion and societal norms. Ivan believes that in order to achieve true freedom, one must be free from the burden of moral responsibility. His philosophical stance, however, leads to a deep existential crisis. The more he rejects the idea of God and moral order, the more he becomes consumed by despair. Ivan's rejection of responsibility for the world and his refusal to believe in divine justice leaves him trapped in a cycle of nihilism, unable to reconcile the idea of freedom with the inherent chaos and suffering in the world. The contrasting character of Alyosha, Ivan's younger brother, offers a different approach to freedom. Alyosha, who is deeply religious and devoted to the teachings of his mentor, Zosima, believes that true freedom is found not in rejecting moral responsibility, but in embracing love and compassion. For Alyosha, freedom is not a burden. It is a gift that allows him to transcend his own ego and live for others. Alyosha's approach to freedom highlights Dostoyevsky's belief that moral and spiritual responsibility is not something to be feared or rejected, but something that can lead to true liberation. His sense of freedom comes from his deep connection to others and to God, rather than from an assertion of individual autonomy. Dostoyevsky also explores the burden of choice in Notes from Underground, where the protagonist, known only as the underground man, is paralyzed by the very idea of freedom. The underground man is a deeply self-conscious individual, acutely aware of his own contradictions and shortcomings. He is unable to make decisions because he is overwhelmed by the infinite possibilities that freedom presents. In his mind, the more choices he has, the less he is able to act. His existential paralysis is a direct result of the weight of freedom. He is so consumed by his own doubts and fears about the consequences of his choices that he is unable to live at all. The underground man's inability to act is a stark reminder of how the burden of absolute freedom can lead to inaction and despair. For Dostoyevsky, freedom is not a simple matter of choosing between right and wrong. It is a constant, agonizing process of making decisions that can shape the course of one's life and the lives of others. In these works, Dostoyevsky portrays freedom as a double-edged sword, both a source of potential greatness and a cause of overwhelming suffering. He recognizes that human beings long for freedom, yet he also understands that the very nature of freedom means being accountable for one's choices, both morally and existentially. Dostoyevsky is keenly aware of the dangers of absolute freedom, especially when it is disconnected from a moral or spiritual framework. His characters, whether they seek freedom through intellectual rebellion, moral transgression, or spiritual rejection, are often punished by the weight of their own choices. Yet, through their suffering, they are also given the opportunity for redemption. The burden of freedom, for Dostoyevsky, is not something to escape from. It is something to confront, with the understanding that the only true freedom lies in the ability to make moral choices and take responsibility for them. In Dostoyevsky's view, the burden of freedom can never be fully escaped. It is the price of human existence. To be human is to face the responsibility of choice, and it is through this responsibility that we define our lives and shape our destinies. But Dostoyevsky does not offer a grim or nihilistic outlook on freedom. Instead, he presents it as a challenge that, when faced with humility and moral clarity, can lead to personal transformation and spiritual liberation. His exploration of freedom is not just a critique of human nature, it is a call to embrace the burden of choice, to recognize that in the very act of choosing, we find the essence of our humanity. Ultimately, Dostoyevsky suggests that freedom is inseparable from the human condition. It is not a gift to be celebrated unconditionally, but a challenge to be met with self-awareness, responsibility, and a deep commitment to the moral and spiritual dimensions of life. The burden of freedom is heavy, but it is through facing that burden that we find meaning, redemption, and ultimately, the truest form of liberation. Dostoyevsky's exploration of human nature is a central theme in his works, and it is one that remains as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. He possessed an uncanny ability to delve into the depths of the human psyche, understanding not only the potential for goodness, but also the darker, more destructive tendencies that reside within us all. For Dostoyevsky, human beings were not simply good or evil, but a complex mixture of both, capable of extraordinary acts of kindness and unspeakable cruelty. His works reveal the tension between these conflicting forces within the soul, showing how individuals can be torn between the desire for redemption and the lure of damnation. This intricate examination of human nature is what makes Dostoyevsky's characters so compelling. They are not mere archetypes, but deeply flawed, multidimensional beings whose inner struggles mirror the complexity of human existence. Dostoyevsky's belief in the duality of human nature is especially evident in The Brothers Karamazov. The novel introduces us to three brothers, each representing a different aspect of humanity. Dmitri, the eldest, embodies passion, impulsiveness, and sensuality. Ivan, the intellectual, represents reason, skepticism, and existential doubt. Alyosha, the youngest, is the embodiment of innocence, faith, and moral purity. The interplay between these three characters creates a profound exploration of human nature, as they each grapple with their own inner demons and attempt to understand the world around them. Dmitri's character is perhaps the most overtly driven by his baser instincts. He is passionate and emotional, prone to fits of rage and despair. Yet, his outward chaos masks a deep internal conflict. Throughout the novel, Dmitri wrestles with his own guilt and desires for redemption, particularly in relation to his father's death. His violent nature, though it often leads him into destructive behavior, is juxtaposed with moments of deep spiritual reflection and longing for a better, more meaningful life. This tension between his primal desires and his yearning for spiritual awakening reflects Dostoyevsky's understanding of the duality within all of us, the struggle between the animalistic urges of the body and the higher aspirations of the soul. Dmitry's journey is one of constant oscillation between these two extremes, as he seeks some form of peace or resolution that will allow him to reconcile his conflicting inner selves. Ivan's character offers a more intellectualized version of this inner conflict. As a philosopher, Ivan questions the very nature of morality, religion, and human suffering. His rejection of God is not born out of a lack of intelligence or curiosity, but rather from an intellectual conviction that the world is unjust, and that a benevolent God cannot possibly allow the suffering of innocents, particularly children. Ivan's arguments are powerful, filled with logical reasoning and profound insight, yet they ultimately fail to bring him peace. The more he rejects the idea of a higher moral order, the more he becomes consumed by despair. This internal collapse is reflected in his famous rebellion against God, where he declares that he cannot accept a world in which innocent people are forced to suffer for the sake of some divine plan. In his rejection of God and morality, Ivan believes he is asserting his own freedom, yet he is, in fact, enslaved by his own inability to reconcile the existential questions that plague him. Alyosha, in contrast, embodies a different aspect of human nature altogether. He is devout, compassionate, and deeply connected to his faith. Throughout the novel, Alyosha's struggle is not one of intellectual doubt or moral depravity, but rather one of finding his place in a world that often seems indifferent to the values he holds dear. Alyosha's innocence and purity make him a beacon of light in the novel, offering a counterpoint to the more troubled and morally ambiguous figures of Dmitry and Ivan. His faith is not simplistic or naive. Rather, it is tested by the complexities of human suffering and the intellectual challenges posed by his brothers. Yet, Alyosha remains steadfast in his belief that love, compassion, and faith are the true paths to salvation, even in a world that seems to be filled with pain and injustice. The juxtaposition of these three characters, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha, creates a dynamic and multifaceted exploration of human nature. Each of them represents a different facet of the human condition, and their interactions reveal the complex ways in which individuals navigate their inner turmoil. Dmitry's impulsive passions, Ivan's intellectual skepticism, and Alyosha's quiet faith all reflect different responses to the same existential dilemmas: the search for meaning, the quest for redemption, and the struggle to reconcile the good and evil within oneself. Through these characters, Dostoyevsky suggests that the path to understanding human nature is not a straightforward one, but a journey marked by contradictions, struggles, and a constant tension between light and dark. This theme of human duality is also explored in Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist Raskolnikov embodies the same tension between good and evil. Raskolnikov is an intelligent young man, deeply conflicted about his place in the world. He believes that certain individuals, particularly those who are intellectually superior, are above the moral laws that govern ordinary people. This belief leads him to commit a murder, convinced that his crime will somehow serve a higher purpose. However, after committing the act, Raskolnikov is overwhelmed by guilt and paranoia. He becomes increasingly tormented by the moral implications of his crime, even as he tries to justify it intellectually. The more he grapples with his inner conflict, the more he descends into psychological chaos. Raskolnikov's journey is one of self-destruction, as his attempt to transcend moral boundaries through violence only leads him to confront the darkest corners of his soul. In the end, it is only through his suffering and eventual confession that Raskolnikov is able to find a path toward redemption. This complex interplay between intellectual arrogance, moral culpability, and spiritual redemption is a key element of Dostoyevsky's exploration of human nature. Dostoyevsky's focus on the complexity of human nature is not limited to the psychological struggles of his characters, but extends to the moral and existential dilemmas they face. He often portrays characters who are forced to confront the fundamental questions of existence, questions about suffering, morality, freedom, and the meaning of life. These characters are not simply grappling with abstract philosophical ideas, but with the real, lived experiences of human beings. The moral dilemmas they face are not theoretical. They are matters of life and death, of salvation and damnation. Through his characters, Dostoyevsky invites the reader to confront these questions alongside them, forcing us to examine our own beliefs and values in light of the deep contradictions that define the human condition. In addition to the moral and psychological complexity of his characters, Dostoyevsky's exploration of human nature also emphasizes the importance of spiritual awakening. For him, the path to understanding human nature is not solely intellectual or moral, it is also deeply spiritual. Many of his characters, like Raskolnikov, Dmitri, and Ivan, must undergo a process of spiritual transformation in order to reconcile the conflicting elements within themselves. This process is not easy, nor is it guaranteed. In fact, Dostoyevsky often shows that spiritual awakening requires suffering, and that it is through suffering that characters come to understand the true nature of their existence. This idea is central to Dostoyevsky's belief in the redemptive power of faith, as he suggests that it is only through confronting the darkest aspects of the human soul that we can truly come to terms with our own nature and find the possibility of redemption. Ultimately, Dostoyevsky's exploration of human nature is a powerful reminder of the complexity of the human experience. His characters are not simple moral figures. They are multifaceted, contradictory, and deeply human. Through their struggles, Dostoyevsky presents a vision of humanity that is neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but somewhere in between. He emphasizes the importance of confronting our inner darkness, of grappling with the complexities of existence, and of seeking redemption through faith, love, and moral responsibility. In doing so, Dostoyevsky offers a profound meditation on the nature of the human soul and the possibility of transformation and redemption, even in the face of overwhelming suffering and despair.